1977's Skip Tracer, also known as Deadly Business, is a Canadian production that, up until recently, not a lot of people had really heard of. Its name is mentioned a few times here and there when discussing Canadian cinema in film history books, but according to Justin Declos, head honcho of Gold Ninja Video, it's an often referenced, seldom seen picture that, up until Gold Ninja's recent release, hadn't really had any kind of home video presence. I myself had never heard of Tracer before Gold Ninja's release, but I read the synopsis, watched a trailer, and figured that it looked like a fairly charismatic but bleak production that kind of put me in the mindset of films like With Nail and I, but maybe emphasising the bleakness more so than the comedy. On giving it its inaugural watch, however, it quickly became apparent that while this thing does have a bit of humour and charisma present, it's really more of a hardened, bleak character drama in the same vein as films like Midnight Cowboy or Taxi Driver. It wasn't something that I was in the headspace to appreciate at the time, so I popped it on the shelf ready for a time when that kind of filmmaking was something that I knew I'd appreciate. And recently, that time came. For those of you not in the know, a skip tracer is essentially Canada's version of a repo man or bailiff. They're hardened individuals usually working as part of a loans company who use intimidation tactics and, depending on the character of your skip tracer in question, mild violence may also be a factor in trying to get money back from folks who've taken out loans with the company who then can't pay it back. Our skip tracer for this movie is a man named John Collins. Collins is a workaholic. He eats, breathes and lives for the skip tracer work that he does. So much so that he's been awarded Man of the Year 3 years running for his work in the field, and he's working on making that a 4th. When asked why he strives so hard to be Man of the Year consistently, he says he wants to be the best and that no one's ever won it 3 years in a row, and now he intends to make it so that no one's ever won it 4 years in a row as well. The film opens with Collins arriving at the home of George Pettigrew. Pettigrew and his family are in debt to the company, and Collins has arrived with a final notice and a for sale sign on George's house. George asks Collins for more time, but Collins coldly informs him that he can't give him more time, that he's on a final notice and that if he doesn't pay by a certain date, the house will be reclaimed by them, before handing George the for sale sign and asking him to knock it in himself. We then follow John as he goes through his day-to-day business of calling customers to remind them that they have payments due, shaking down customers who've gone well past their due date before he stops off at a local bar for a quick drink and bumps into Brent. Brent is a fairly new starter to the tracer profession. He's lower rung, he barely meets his quota, and probably worst of all for the profession, he's nice. The pair haven't really met prior to this, but Collins is obviously a big name at the company, so Brent takes the opportunity to ask if John would mind having him around. Mainly to do the jobs he can't be bothered to do, or just to observe how he does what he does so that he can gain experience. John is very much against the idea and flat out tells him no on multiple occasions, but Brent is persistent. John gives him some advice amounting to get out of this business because he acknowledges that it can be crushing and you have to be a very specific type of person to be able to deal with the weight that it puts on you. But Brent continues to push for it, so eventually John takes him out on a job that he knows is going to be difficult. It's on a mud-filled construction site with a client who basically owes them a car. This client's also known to be violent. John sets Brent loose and he's forced to wade through knee-deep bogs of mud, but after some time he returns smiling with the keys. John's bemused by this, telling Brent only after the fact that he was certain that Brent was going to get his teeth kicked in. John and Brent continue to shadow together, and later that night, an incident occurs. John's been tracking a client who's been in debt to them for weeks, and finally he finds an opportunity to pounce and take a car as collateral while the client is visiting a friend. Only, once John and Brent have captured the car by breaking a window, they phone it into the station, only to be told the system says it's already been paid up in full, and that they're now legally obliged to go and return the car to the owner, who, when we last saw them, was threatening to kill them. John and Brent just about manage to get the car back to the owner, but Brent gets slugged in the gut for his troubles, but this throws John a bit, as previously he's been working to the understanding that his clients are just that, lifeless individuals who have assets to be seized and nothing more. This is then compounded when the next day, when John goes in to complain to his boss about the previous night's botch, he finds that his office has been completely cleared out. His boss Henry tells him that a memo has come in from upper management essentially saying that they think that John isn't hungry for the job anymore, and that the slip-up last night makes them think he might be losing focus. So, they're returning him to working on the office floor, with the condition that if he manages to beat his quota from the previous year, they'll allow him back into his private office again. Arriving at his new desk with all his files unceremoniously dumped there, Collins is then introduced to Walter, a desperate man looking for a loan. Walter's wife has kidney failure. Local hospitals won't take her on as they say conventional treatment won't work. He says, however, that a doctor in the Philippines has an alternative surgery that offers a much better success rate. Collins asks why Walter doesn't just go to the bank for a loan. Walter is skittish and says that he can definitely pay the loan back as both he and his wife draw a pension. The house got paid off last year, but because he's unemployed, the banks won't touch him. John very carefully and quietly reiterates that they would get a better interest rate if they went to a bank, and that he could lose his job just for telling him that. But Walter's made his mind up and takes on a loan with the company, which, again, really unsettles John. The next day, Brent and John are back out running jobs. They stop by a car dealership to check in as to whether George Pettigrew has finally managed to get the money together to pay his debt. But the boss of the dealership tells the pair that he sent George home to recuperate, as he lashed out at a customer recently and had been dealing with heavy amounts of stress for the past couple of weeks. He says that George should be back in a week or so. After running a couple more cases, the pair retreat to a go-go club where they meet up with Leo, a veteran of the field who's basically nearing retirement. Leo gives not a single fuck about the people around him or people's thoughts of him. He's fully committed to the job he does 24/7. He has no one and wants for nothing but the next case closed. While John goes to make a call, Brent tries to get some tips from Leo, who basically gives a big display of how unbothered he is by people around him and basically tells Brent that if you care, you have no place in the business. John returns and the pair travel on to the next job, but on the way he stops off by his apartment to grab something, and just as he's about to head inside, someone in a hockey mask jumps out, shivs him and runs off. After a while, Brent heads inside to look for him and finds him bleeding out outside of his apartment. Brent calls the cops and an ambulance service turn up, and when we next pick up, some time has passed and John is in the hospital, very weak, but he is ultimately going to recover. Brent drops in to visit with some flowers and a card from the office, and he gives a quick update. He reveals that while John's been out of it, other workers have managed to beat his targets and that John is now around 30 cases behind the rest. He says that the cops can't really do anything about the incident because, given John's profession, there are too many suspects to even begin looking into it, and Brent reveals that he's been fired for not hitting his quotas. In fact, that's really one of the main reasons that he's come to visit John, because he wants him to tell his boss that the reason Brent missed his quotas was that he was working with Collins, and that if you add those jobs onto his own work, he was actually meeting his targets. John refuses to help Brent, and even when Brent offers to take on Collins' casebook while he's out of action, he basically tells him to fuck off before getting a nurse to bring him a phone so that he can call George Pettigrew, who he suspects as being the guy who tried to kill him, to subtly hint that he knows and also to remind him that he's got a final deadline approaching. And with that, John begins rehabilitation. But something's different now, as post-stabbing, John seems to have realised that he's leaving himself a legacy of tormenting people and creating misery. A feeling that only grows when George Pettigrew's wife turns up at the apartment covered in bruises, literally begging him to give them more time to get the money and offering to do anything to hold the problem off. And I'm going to leave it there in terms of the plotting because I really don't want to spoil this one for you guys. It's definitely worth checking out. In a rock-solid finale, will John's attempted murderer strike again? Will John develop and grow as a human being? And who will win Man of the Year? All this and more will be answered if you check out Skip Tracer. And probably the thing that sticks with me about this film more than anything else is that this was the first feature film to be written or directed by Zale Dalen. And the reason that's amazing is this film really doesn't feel like someone's first spluttered collapse out of the gate. This film feels like it was made by somebody half a dozen features in who's only about a film or two away from peaking in their craft. In that regard, it's incredible that this thing exists and is as competent and well made as it is. I should probably also stress at this point that I'm going to be referencing materials available in Gold Ninja Video's release of Skip Tracer for the most part, in part because actual information on this film is pretty scarce, but also in part because the release itself is actually just really solid if you want to learn more about Canadian cinema, and I feel like knowing the context of how this film came to be will really help give it an extra layer of life. I'm not being paid to cover this film or anything like that. Justin just seems like a good egg doing a good thing, and I can't really fault what he's done here. One of the things that I love about the script for this thing is that it feels lived, for lack of a better descriptive. It feels like Zale had at least some first-hand experience of how these people operate. And in a way, he did. His dad used to work for a life insurance company that operated similar practices, and Zale was almost kind of the Brent of that scenario. Because his dad really didn't want him to follow him into life insurance, and eventually when Zale got to college, he dropped out of his studies that would have enabled that to instead take a course on filmmaking. As such, the script for this piece really feels quite honest and sincere about the Tracer experience. It certainly doesn't really pull any punches in what it's trying to say or show. A definite selling point for me with this was its depth, with multiple levels of detail that viewers are almost certain to miss the first time around, meaning each rewatch reveals just an extra bit of information that really helps only firm the film up even further. An example for me being on this rewatch when John goes back to his desk shortly after having completed his first round of tracer jobs for the day, he sits and takes stock of what he's done that morning, and I noticed this time around that on his desk is a framed photo of a kid. John had a family, and in the pursuit of Man of the Year and keeping himself afloat, he appears to have lost everything, and isolated himself in the process. John's family are never mentioned on screen or seen, but with just that one shot, you instantly know that John has been through some shit and lost a lot, and likely feels like being Man of the Year is all he has left. And that's a core theme really for this whole movie. It's a film about humanity, legacy, and what you want to make out of the life you have. John here experiences compassion in an environment that doesn't breed it. He faces the consequences of his own actions, whether direct or on behalf of his company, and he's forced to finally take the time to be introspective about his own life choices, to really, truly decide whether this is something that he can live with both Brent and Leo acting almost as representations for the potential direction that John could go in. Whether it's a life outside of the Tracer business where his life comes before his job, a la Brent, or whether he just fully submerges himself into this business and winds up a lonely, isolated and cold figure like Leo. And I think the way the film presents that journey is frankly superb. What we have here is a 94-minute film that keeps a really rock-solid pace across the full runtime, presenting a dirty business in all its unpleasantness. It has 3 clean act structures that it seamlessly transitions between as we follow John from a man just following orders to a realisation of his own mortality, through to the final act where he has to make difficult decisions about his own future. The script oozes atmosphere and effortlessly glides its way through the subject in a very naturalistic and believable way. There wasn't a moment in this film where I felt it got overly schmaltzy or unrealistic. Zale is clearly a very good writer of characters because everyone in this world is very well fleshed out. They all have their faults and complexities. There's nothing clean about any of them, and even the best of them either have acknowledged faults or are corruptible. The best part is, these characters aren't even just solo self-contained manifestations. The interactions that these characters have between each other again feel very believable and true to real life. I could believe a character like Brent brown-nosing up to characters like Leo and John to try and get a foot on the ladder and naively assuming that the business can be done with just a smile and some nice words. I could totally believe a character like Leo would be totally repressed to the point that he'd actively will people onto the streets without batting an eyelid. A situation like John and George's problem isn't just a possibility, it's a likely scenario that many folks encounter on a daily basis around the world. And when you take those characters, the subtext and the scenario and throw in some fantastic dialogue, which makes the characters infinitely watchable, with some great lines, solid attention to detail and, most importantly, heart, well, like I said at the top of this review, the fact that this came from a first-time filmmaker is just astounding to me. In fact, the only thing I can really say about the script that does fall a little short is that it's very slow burn as a piece. which isn't strictly a bad thing, and while it does manage to keep that slow burn pace largely under control for most of the runtime, there were a couple of moments in the second act where it just began to fumble a little bit for me. Like, it started to slow down just a little too much. Mercifully, this was just before the third act, and they do course correct fine enough, but when I can confidently say that this film sits easy at 94 minutes and how difficult it is to do slow burn cinema as well, I hope that imparts just how well handled the script is on the whole. As mentioned, the script was written and directed by Zale Dalen. He has 21 directing credits and 2 writing credits. This was his first on both counts, and from here he'd go on to have quite a successful career in TV, with titles including Alfred Hitchcock Presents, 21 Jump Street and Kung Fu: The Legend Continues. His last credit was in 2002, and as far as I can see, he's now pretty much retired from the industry. On the direction front, I think it's good, but not great. Zale definitely had a clear creative vision for this piece, and the end result is a technically proficient and stable production. It's not afraid to experiment with lighting or colour, but while I'd say this film is definitely on the level creatively, it is also a bit stiff. It very much feels like a film made by someone who's just been to film school, hasn't quite found their voice yet visually, and is sticking to the rules of film as rigidly as possible to minimise the risk of issues. Scenes are structured in a very simple way, largely static cuts that follow the standard establishing, wide, mid-close, close, back and forth, two-shot, mid-close, wide scene design structuring. They do break with that formula occasionally, but it's not as confident as the script in wanting to do that. This feels very much like a production striving to play it safe for the most part, but occasionally wanting to tiptoe just outside of its comfort zone as a growth exercise. Which is fine. Hell, I've seen productions where they've forgotten to take the lens cap off the camera. But it did leave me thinking that a bit more dynamism within the scene structuring, maybe just a few more shots, a bit more movement within the frame, really would have taken this piece to the next level. Direction of the cast, however, is not an issue. Zane either really got lucky on a superb cast selection, or he has a superb ability as a cast director. Because everyone here seems to know exactly what they're doing, how much or how little to interact with the scene and set environment, improvisation was seemingly encouraged and then shaped. It feels very professional, more so than most actual professional productions that came out that year. Most importantly, both the direction and cast direction feel fresh. The late 70s was kind of an era of change within the cinematic landscape. Given the advent of the blockbuster within the decade, a lot of productions around this time were still clinging onto the old ways of filmmaking, essentially presenting cinema as a theatrical production that just so happened to be captured on film. This, for low budget, feels fresh. It feels like a progressive step into an era of filmmaking that was yet to come. Which, given how little this film really gets brought up in wider discourse, is frankly shocking. On the cine front, we find a film that feels, again, a little bit basic in terms of compositional choices, but not a film that feels afraid to experiment with the colour and lighting. And I feel that that's an aspect that really helps lift the simple direction just enough to put it comfortably above passable. Here we have some interesting and considered light play. While it mostly lands for me, there were at least a couple of moments where I could see what they were trying to do, but it didn't quite land as intended. This film also has a quite common issue that 70s productions seem to have had, in which some of the scenes required additional lighting to either fill in shadowy elements of the frame or to light up the subject up front, but because the lights available at the time were quite rudimentary, it means some of the shots end up looking a little flat and floodlit, which did kind of pull me out of the action a little, especially when things are supposed to have a bit of grit and darkness thrown in. And the same goes for the colour play, with plenty of neon-soaked sequences during the night patrols largely landing as intended, but some of the colour work inadvertently makes the production look overly murky, resulting in a picture that can be quite a bit low detail or hard to make out. As always, I'll always champion a film that tries and fails or gets mixed results, than one that doesn't try at all. And it must be reiterated that these issues are quite few and far between, but they did ultimately happen often enough that I had to take notice. Performance-wise, this is essentially a character piece for David Peterson, who arguably here gives the performance of his career. The character of John Collins is not an easy role to play. It's a multi-layered, multi-textural role that requires a deep understanding of not only the character, but the environment that shaped the character. And David here absolutely owns that. He brings just the right amount of charisma and physicality to the role to give the impression of a man largely bottling his feelings and masking with bluntness and gentle snark to make it through the day. It's an incredible performance from Peterson that I honestly don't think could have been bettered. And God help anyone that ever attempts to rival it, as they'll have the work cut out for them. It's a masterclass, honestly. The same can also be said for Rudy Zabo, who plays Leo in this. He's kind of having to play John but amplified, a quiet individual who presents as not giving a shit about anything or anyone, who seems to have almost completely hollowed out his morality in order to survive. Rudy here is phenomenal, giving an astounding performance with a nice physicality that swings between incredibly subtle and collected to loud and blunt if required. He's fantastic. Probably the weakest element in this is John Lazarus as Brent. He's not bad per se, but he's surrounded by actors giving very naturalistic conversational style performances, and it doesn't seem like his strongest quality. Instead, he opts to lean into a more theatrical delivery style, in which he does a pretty good job, honestly, but to me, it just didn't quite gel as smoothly with the tones the other cast members were going for. It makes him feel a bit odd one out. Like I say, he doesn't give a bad performance at all, and he's really quite good, but yeah. That's also not to do a disservice to the supporting cast either. While they don't appear on screen all that much across the runtime, the likes of Sue Astley and Alan Rose as George and Sue Pettigrew were well-rounded and really well handled. Jack Leaf as Walter was a heartbreaking situation, leaving a big impact on myself as a viewer for such a short appearance on screen. And Mike Grigg as Henry Belden, John's boss, tells you everything you need to know about the business that John's in with a simple passing glance. I honestly can't tell you how solid the cast in this really truly are. And finally, the soundtrack, and it's a bit of a mixed bag for me truthfully. There's two styles present, a cheap early 80s solo synth sounding set of arrangements and a drum and bassy synth set that make up the score for the whole production. The former, I feel, didn't suit the film at all. It felt too upbeat for this kind of a production. The cheapness of the sound of the synth also didn't help. The latter felt much more in tone with the film and really helped give the thing a personality boost. But it was also a little repetitive and did feel a bit overused by the time the end credits rolled around. I almost got the feeling like the score for this felt like a last-minute rush job, less like it was considered to be produced that way, and more that it was acknowledged a scoreless film ran a little dry, so they just slapped on whatever they could get their hands on for the budget and what time they had left before release. It isn't awful, but it just feels a bit odd throughout for me. As mentioned, Skip Tracer didn't really get any kind of home video release either within Canada or globally. It played in theatres, it might have got the rare occasional screening on TV, but it never made the jump. That is until Justin and the gang over at Gold Ninja Video contacted Zale, and working with both him and the Libraries and Archives of Canada, they were able to secure a copy of the film for a 2K scan and remaster. And in 2022, Skip Tracer was finally released on Blu-ray. The picture quality is very impressive, it sounds great, and it's packed with extra features, including a full commentary with Justin and Zale, an in-depth career retrospective with Zale, hosted by Justin, a 14-minute overview of Canadian cinema and its differences from Canucksploitation cinema, and as a bonus feature, Zale's final film to date, a previously unreleased picture called Passion, which I have yet to check out. But it may well make its way up to the channel soon, given how much I enjoyed this. At the time of recording, the film is still available over at Gold Ninja Video, and I highly recommend going to grab it as soon as possible. As of the time of recording, it's limited to 800 copies. I bought mine a year or two ago, and mine was number 764. So if there are any left by the time this video goes live, there likely won't be many. Skip Tracer in many ways was very much ahead of its time, a bleak film exploring the morals of a capitalist-driven practice that for 1977 feels refreshing and, if anything, quite the vision of how early 80s cinema would shake out. For a film that was shot within a month for a budget of $175,000, it's a testimony and beacon to low-budget filmmakers of what can be achieved outside of the Hollywood system. And I highly recommend grabbing a copy while you still can.